Hello, my name is Seung. I'm working at Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok, Thailand. With this presentation today, I want to overview my planned paper titled "Social Imaginary: A Theoretical Approach to the Study of Media, Religion, and Secularities." With my paper, I want to propose social imaginary as a theoretical framework to explore religion, media, and secularities. And to do this, I will try to intersect and translate between Charles Taylor's discussion on social imaginary and the religion as mediation approach that is quite familiar with us. In my paper, I will also try to uh, briefly introduce my past case study on the secular journalistic representations of Korean evangelicals to showcase the intersection between these two approaches, like the social imaginary and the religion as mediation approach, and also to showcase how this concept of social imaginary, how this helps explore religion, media, and secularities all together in their interwoven relationships with each other. And my main argument will be like the collectively imagining bodies and their practices of mediation and materialization of the imaginaries, religious imaginaries or secular imaginaries or social imaginaries. They are the common and central concern for these two theoretical frameworks. Trustfully, he says he borrowed this term imaginary from French scholars. It's more popular and frequently used in the French scholarship, especially among the historians. He is more indebted to Benedict Anderson's, his well-known work, Imagine Communities. And also he is also indebted to Arjun Apardrai's discussion on the importance of the imagination in the modern everyday lives. It is noteworthy that they are all joined the same intellectual platform, like the Center for Transcultural Studies and the Journal of Public Culture. So let me roughly define what he means by social imaginary. It can be defined as a complex, unstructured, and not fully articulated form of understanding of how people imagine themselves and other social beings and their social surroundings, the world or history, their time, or even the cosmos, something like that. We need to understand this concept within his continuing efforts to explore and theorize multiple modernities, multiple secularities. So Charles Taylor, he proposes a cultural understanding of Western modernity. So, which means that he opposed to the Western-centric and the universalist understanding of modernity that is often narrated as culture-neutral operation of science, technology, and capital over time and space. And he wants to kind of provincialize Western modernity by explaining it regarding the rise of a new culture that was specific to 17th century, 18th century, 19th century Europe. A new culture, it means the rise of new modern social imaginaries of market economy, public sphere, and self-governing people. The main point of Charles Taylor is that in the early modern period in the Western world, people began to imagine themselves in a new way as a self-governing people, getting away from God's ruling or God's dominance over them, for instance. And this kind of imagination came to shape kind of substantial and real legislation and legal system and legal social space. And to talk about this rise of new culture, he comes and he uses this concept of social imaginary. This is what he says. So he says, I adopt the term imaginary because my focus is on the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings. And this is often not expressed in theoretical terms, but is carried in images, stories, and legends, which we usually call media, right? It is also the case that theory is often the possession of a small minority, whereas what is interesting in the social imaginary is that it is shared by large groups of people, if not the whole society. And the social imaginary is that common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. So he says, Taylor says this social imaginary, it is closer to what some philosophers of phenomenology call the background. So social imaginary includes the understanding of history, time, order, and even more of God, of the cosmos, and of the good in which our practices and positions are understood and expected in a particular way. So this social imaginary not only makes possible our understanding of our positions and our practice, our everyday practices, but also this social imaginary legitimizes and justifies our practices and our positions in our collective social world. This social imaginary functions as the interpretive and normative scheme of our everyday life and practices. Social imaginary is not expressed in theoretical terms or explicit belief, but it is carried in images, stories, and legends. And he also says it is expressed in rituals that's something we do with our bodies, right? In symbols and in works of art. So what could be broadly called media and embodied ritual practices, they are highlighted as the material sites that researchers can find out social imaginaries, and these material sites, they carry and mediate and circulate social imaginaries. Social imaginaries, they are expressed in our bodily rituals, embodied rituals, our practices, social practices, and works of art, and also our everyday conversations, stories, legends, modes of addresses. He thinks that there is some larger understanding of the world and history and time and moral order, which makes our concrete practice, everyday practices, as meaningful. But from now on, I will try to insert this concept of imaginaries into the core arguments of the religion as mediation approach to showcase how these two approaches can be intersected and translated between each other. So given that the divine and the transcendent, they are likely invisible and intangible, right? So that's why imaginaries are essential to religion, because we are not able to touch and sense and experience those divine being, the transcendent being, in an immediate way. There must be some mediations of imaginaries. And media are essential to this mediation and materialization of the professed and imagined transcendent. So before the practice of mediation, the so-called transcendent, the so-called divine, they exist in the consciousness of religious subjects in the form of collectively shared imaginaries. So I'm presenting this idea from the viewpoint of phenomenology. We don't know whether the transcendent is really there. But we can certainly talk about our experience of that transcendent being. So we can say that before the practice of mediation, the transcendent, the divine being, exists in the consciousness of religious subjects in the form of imaginaries. And then that transcendent, that divine being, comes to acquire visibility, tangibility, and materiality only when the imaginaries of the transcendent are mediated, materialized, and circulated by what Mayer calls technologies of sensation, like body, virtual space, images, text, dress, and food, or other material forms of mediating this transcendent being to our bodily senses, human perception. And this body, virtual space, images, text, dress, and food, all these can be understood as broadly as media in the religion as mediation approach, right? Now let me try to intersect and translate between these two approaches in a different way. So as Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities highlights, our social world is inevitably imagined, right? It's too big. So it cannot but be imagined among the large groups of people, right? And it is held and maintained together by the mediation and circulation of these imaginaries of themselves as a society. So now what I'm trying to do is to propose media and religion both as the technologies and practices of mediating, materializing, and circulating these collective imaginaries, whether they are social imaginaries or whether they are religious imaginaries or secular imaginaries or non-secular imaginaries or post-secular imaginaries. We could identify these imaginaries as social imaginaries, religious imaginaries, or secular imaginaries according to the case study we are taking into consideration. Let me try to kind of justify and legitimize my argument. So social imaginaries encompasses a broader background understanding of time, history, order, and the good, or even more like of God, of the cosmos, right? And or they are, all of them are transcendent and invisible to human senses and perception, right? History, order, time, the good, they are not visible to our human perception in an immediate way. Time, history, order, and the good, they are not that different from what Maya calls a professed beyond, or the professed transcendent, or the non-empirical. In that, given that, they all require certain forms and certain technologies and practices of mediation to reach human perception, human senses, and human understanding. So, and if this is the case, it would be fascinating to explore a religious group's imaginaries or the public's imaginaries of a particular religion within the broader context of social imaginaries, whether they are secular imaginaries or post-secular imaginaries or non-secular imaginaries. In this way, we can, at the level of imaginaries, we can examine the dynamics and intersections between among media, religion, and secularities all together. Because we are talking about secular or non-secular or post-secular imaginaries, and religion and media are conceptualized and discussed as the practices and technologies of mediating, materializing, and circulating these collective imaginaries. Here I will very briefly introduce my case study to show you how I was using this concept, social imagery, to explore the interwoven relationship between media, religion, and secularities in the kind of secular Korean society. In 2015, a guy who was standing against the US military regime, he attacked the US ambassador with his knife, and that kind of terrorist attack was getting so much media attention by the Korean media, and all of a sudden these Korean evangelicals, they came into the public space, and they performed this shamanistic and traditional Korean fan dance in one of the famous landmarks in Seoul, wishing for the recovery of the knife attack the US ambassador. And what they actually did was actually the shamanistic, a very well-known shamanistic rituals to console the spirits, in the traditional meaning, traditional sense. So these shamanistic rituals by these Korean evangelicals got lots of media coverage because it was so interesting. It was a very interesting encounter between shamanism and evangelicalism in the secular or post-secular or non-secular setting of Korean society. So I tried to explore the secular journalistic representations of Korean evangelicals like these photographic images here, as the material sites of mediating, carrying, and circulating social imaginaries of Korean evangelicalism and also Korean modernity. And I was able to capture social imaginaries of Korean evangelicalism in that instant, which was happening in 2015. At the time, the public presence of Korean evangelicals, they were imagined as, and felt and experienced as outdated, anachronistic, and pre-modern, and irrational, and dangerous. And this kind of understanding of Korean evangelicals was enabled by a broader understanding of time and world history and Korean modernization. So I was able to capture the social imaginaries of world history in whose linear timeline, in whose teleological timeline, Korean modernity was imagined as not secular enough and far falling behind Western modernity. So in this way, I was able to explore and talk about not only media representations of this evangelical religious group, but also the social imaginaries of modernity, Korean modernity, and world history in the Korean context, which enables this kind of photographic representation and makes people experience and feel their public presence as anachronistic, pre-modern, irrational, and dangerous. So I'm just trying to show you these photographic images where we could detect and find emerging and circulating and mediating and materializing of the particular social imaginaries of Korean evangelicals and Korean modernity, and further the world history. So that's it. Every scholar watching this presentation, be safe in this pandemic period. Thank you for watching up to now.